welcome to the Religious Studies Project. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, whatever time it is, we're happy to have you here. My name is Dave McConaughey, and today I'm joined by...
Bree Fallon. How are you going, Dave?
I'm going quite well. It's so Australian to ask, how am I going?
Sorry.
Ça va? Ça va bien?
It's very Aussie.
It is a little Aussie, and I like it. I think I'm gonna say it more now. It's going pretty well. It's early for me and late for you,
That's
and so
right.
both of us are just doing what we can to make the podcast happen. What do we have this week that we're about to listen to?
This week we have a wonderful podcast by the ever-prolific Sydney Castillo, and he interviewed Yulo Volk about narrating belief, vernacular religion in India. Take it away.
And now we are back with the Religious Studies Project podcast. It's now the EASR conference 2019 in Tartu, Estonia is officially over, but we still are, because we like to work a lot and hard, we are still doing podcast interviews. And now I'm happy to have here Ulo Volk from the University of Tartu here with me in the podcast. Welcome, Professor Volk, to the Religious Studies Project.
Well, thank you, and welcome to the Department of Estonian Comparative Folklore. We are sitting here in this library, and this folkloristics of religion. This approach is one that we are introducing here at the University of Tartu, and perhaps we will talk about this as well. What makes it different from other approaches that we heard so many examples, so many possible methodologies and conceptual tools that were discussed during the conference.
Exactly. It's very stimulating to be in a room like this because we feel like we are in an academic ambient and context, so we can ask properly the questions related to this. But first, I would like to do a brief introduction of Professor Volk. Dr. Ulo Volk is a professor of Estonian and comparative folklore at the University of Tartu. His publications include The Black Gentleman, Manifestations of the Devil in Estonian Folk Religion, and 2 edited volumes, Vernacular Religion in Everyday Life, and Storied and Supernatural Places. His recent research has focused on belief, narratives, place lore, folklore in the social context, and vernacular Hinduism. So, I will just dive right in with the questions, and I would like to ask this very broad question to try to situate our listeners a little bit. How can we understand folk religion and its relationship with the supernatural?
Well, you used the concept of folk religion, and perhaps we will start with this. It used to be a traditional way of talking about, folk beliefs as a kind of survival, and folk religion, it appeared as some kind of set of old beliefs and practices that is in opposition to the institutionalized religion like Christianity.
Right.
And that's definitely not the way how we understand it today. And the shift has been away actually from folk religion as some kind of topic or some kind of system of beliefs towards methodology, towards theory and approaches. Folk religion, it offers one way to view religious phenomena as cultural phenomena. And if we talk about folk religion, we talk more about the community, what is shared between the people, and includes shared forms of expressions that we call genres. But then there is another approach, and that's what we call vernacular religion. It is seeing religion through this lens of vernacularity. And this concept was introduced by Leonard Primiano, an American folklorist, and folklorists have been talking about vernacular culture in many connections. Like you take Henry Glassie or Richard Bauman. But what makes vernacular approach different from studying folk religion is that it's more focused on individuality, on subject, and on creativity. Folk, as you can understand, it talks about a group of people and something that is shared. But vernacularity is more about it shows this dynamics of religion on individual level, and it also includes this ambiguous relationship with institutionalized forms and with power, with authority. So the two are not synonyms. That's something. It's a common mistake. I know my colleague Leonard Primiano. He's often is quite disappointed when he sees that his concept of vernacular religion has been used just to replace the old-fashioned word folk. It's not. I think that both of them are useful, but it's good to see them as two closely connected but still different approaches. Mm-hmm. Now to the question of the supernatural. Mm-hmm. And of course, we know originally it's a kind of theological or philosophical term, and there is also a discussion that perhaps we should not use it at all because it's a kind of Western concept. Mm-hmm. And there are so many cultures in the world that don't use this. It's a kind of intellectual colonialism or something like this. But when you look at the situation, in Europe and also in many countries, the term has been turned into a vernacular concept. It has become an emic term with a huge field of meanings, and I find these concepts quite helpful. Sometimes words, if they become very technical, very narrow terms, they are not so useful to make sense of phenomena like religion or culture, because the semantic field is so broad. Mm-hmm. But as we people who work from this perspective of folkloristics of religion, mm-hmm. we mainly work with textual material. So our focus is connected to discourse, to verbal expressions, right. Different kind of genres, and we see also the supernatural as a function, as an expressive mode of certain genres, mm-hmm. and this is related to the enchantment of the world. We see that the world is composed of many different outlooks, possibilities to understand this, and these are connected to the modes of expression. Mm-hmm. And in folklore we talk a lot about genres. Right. That these genres are connected with tradition, and they offer different perspectives, different outlooks on the world, and that's a kind of a Bachtinian mm-hmm. approach. Bakhtin he wrote about the speech genres, so that's very close to what we are doing.
This is a very good start to try to make a differentiation between concepts, because oftentimes, as you said, they either are used as synonyms or is overlap mm-hmm. one with the other. Mm-hmm. So now that we have that clear, now in your presentation or presentation of the ASR, you touched one of those topics that was the difference between truth and belief. So now I would like to ask, truth and belief are categories constantly in dispute in the study of religion. How can we develop an useful approach to study them?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. We know that in Western epistemology, what is how knowledge is generally defined or understood, it is justified through belief. The question is how the justification works, or what makes some arguments valid and the others not valid. But exactly, I think that these two concepts are not enough. It's much better to have more words. Like one of the keynote lectures that was given by Lotte Tarkka, professor of folklore studies from Helsinki, spoke a lot about imagination. And now we have truth, belief, imagination, and definitely knowledge. And I would like to refer to the work of one philosopher, Paul Hoyningen-Hyne, who has written about how knowledge is produced in the sciences. Mm-hmm. And he has shown that what makes scientific knowledge different is not its content if compared with everyday knowledge, but its systematicity. Scientific knowledge is systematic. Right. But what we can call vernacular mm-hmm. knowledge that is connected to belief and truth. It is more disordered, more loose. It is open. It's also semantically open, and of course it's connected with different forms of expression. As scientists or scholars with religion, we are used to give lectures, or we write articles, or we write monographs, and there are certain rules of our genres. But if I talk with you just as a person to the person, and I would like to share you, for example, some ghost narratives from Tartu, or some people who have had some trouble with aliens or the UFOs, it would be another very informal form of communication and form of genre. And that's interesting how these arguments of belief are made in these genres. They're different from the scientific argumentation that is systematic, that relies to previous research, that is connected to quantitative approach very, very often. But for example, I have to convince you that the neighboring house here, the restaurant Werner, the cafe Werner, it's really a haunted house. Well, my daughter used to work there as a waitress years ago, and she told me there was this tradition of storytelling among the young waitresses that the house was haunted, that they heard some footsteps and some lights, and it was a bit scary to be the last person in the building. And it was very interesting for me to see this incipient tradition. It is how young people work together in an old house, and how this tradition is emerging.
Right.
And now, how to conceptualize this? Is it, it's a belief narrative, because of course we have a lot of questions, and in our rational world we are generally skeptical, but this all belongs to this genre that we call memorates or legends, also expressing doubt and disbelief, and expressing disagreements. So I think the concept of belief is useful because it doesn't fix the meaning. It expresses a kind of a modality towards the ways how we see the world, how we discuss it, and truth. Of course, it's a big word, and I think it's not very, very common to talk about this in vernacular, right? It's in oral communication. It's a more the question about the goal of scholarship.
Exactly.
And it's also a religious concept, because all religions are somehow they're truthful. They're connected with this notion.
Claims of truth in some way. Exactly. I think for better situating all of these concepts, we will dive more into your research. And this is about the next question I want to try to orientate. In your EASR presentation, you presented ethnographic data about the Mayang of North India under everyday understanding of supernatural practices. How does this case give insight on the different ways people relate to belief and facts of experience?
Well, I've been visiting some places in Northeast India, in Assam, for many years, and one of them is this famous cluster of villages known as Mayong. It's famous for magical knowledge, magical practices, tantra, mantra. And I have discovered that there are many magicians. There are perhaps around 100 or nearly 100 semi-professional, professional magicians who specialize in snake bites and who is dealing with exorcism and who is more skilled in divination and etc. And there is also a very lively storytelling tradition among them and about these badges. A lot of stories are projected into the past. They talk, for example, about human-animal transformations. The tigers were very active in this region. Now there is no jungle, or very little jungle is left. The tigers are gone. And there were these classical stories about magical flights and fights between the badges, the magician magical fights, and also murders by black magic, all kind of tricks that were made with the visitors. And it's interesting to see how the story world, how it functions, how it empowers also the magical practices. It somehow builds up this aura of the place, this knowledge of a place as a special place. Otherwise, if you look, it's just an ordinary Assamese village. There is nothing really that makes it unique or distinct. But this shows how common storytelling, how it works to enchant a place and also authorize, give power to the people who practice, who carry on the traditions there.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Speaking about this enchantment, you spoke about this as well. Like there are mechanisms of enchantment, and in this case of this village, could you speak a little bit more about that?
Mm-hmm. Well, in this village, what has been quite surprising for me is to see how lively is the tradition of mantras. Mm-hmm. It's in two ways. There are magical manuscripts, mantra putis, and often they are kept in the families, and they give also a kind of authority to the pages. They are not always using them, reciting them, but it's a source of magical power. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, sometimes they are considered dangerous. So if nobody to continue the tradition, they are burned on the pyre, or they are thrown into a river, because there is this idea that the mantras are connected with certain deities, goddesses, and they need worship, they need sacrifice. For example, if you don't do this, then they turn against you. It is so. So there are these manuscripts, certain traditions connected to them, but there is a lot of knowledge that is transmitted orally, and many mantras are also they are born today. I have discovered how the pages they can revive a tradition or start reading a manuscript of mantras that has been totally forgotten. They say they don't understand the language. It's not Sanskrit, it's not Hindi, but they start reading it somehow, and it starts to work. So this possibility that tradition can be revived. Mm-hmm. Also, the tradition that is there in the past, for example, the story world, or the knowledge that was there about human animal transformations, people carry this on, and there is also a belief that it's not gone. It is possible to make it alive again if necessary. So again, we see this relationship between practices and story world and belief, and a sense of a place that keeps attracting hundreds and thousands of people who consult them. They come from far away, from big cities. Also educated people, of course, it is, and politicians. There were elections in India now recently. So to use this magical knowledge to support running for the parliament, this is not an uncommon. Maybe it's not so public. So this difference between public and private culture is also there in India.
Mm-hmm. Sure. One of the things that I remember from the presentation is also the approach that you take on vernacular religion is individuality. Mm-hmm. And you have many vignettes of different magicians that were describing the process of how to proceed with a particular ritual, or how to make enchanting of a charm, or to achieve this human animal transformation to the tiger. Mm-hmm. It was very, very, I think, sui generis in that sense that you were focusing on them. You speak a little bit more about those cases.
Mm-hmm. Well, now that is vernacular dimension in religion, that we are not working with some old stuff, with some old stories, or just we're working with people. And the people have the life stories, they have the characters, they have the specializations. And I have been working with a few pages. Most of them are men whose life stories are quite different. Also, whose status in the village is different. Some of them have been very poor, and some more well-to-do. Most of them belong to Neo-Vaishnava tradition. That's also an interesting contradiction, because in Neo-Vaishnava tradition you are not supposed to worship the goddess or to be involved in tantra. It's more a bhakti movement about Krishna and certain forms of public worship, but how the same people can be carriers of alternative, different traditions, and how they shift from I would not say it's shifting between identities, individual identities, but it's shifting between different forms of knowledge or different forms of religious culture. So some of them have been raising assistant spirits, for example, working with them. There's a lively storytelling tradition about their mothers have never tried this, but of course they know the other magicians who use the help of assistant spirits. And there are local Assamese and there are Bengali people who have come in who carry a different kind of magical tradition. So to look at this diversity and to see it on the individual level, it's very, very interesting. And here is the space or this dimension in religion that I think we need to work more. It is these ethnographic methods, and I know that you are an anthropologist, you are a field work. I think that's what makes our work really fascinating.
Definitely, to see the outlook of people as it is and in its own terms, I think there's a lot of value for scholarship on that. I think we're going to move to the last question that we have here. And it's kind of to understand this dimension of like more nuanced outlook of having it's not contradiction, but it's just things that cohabit in the same place at the same time. How does this liminal epistemological uncertainty proves useful for comprehending religious phenomena? Because you spoke about this in your presentation.
Yeah, well, there are these two concepts. What I mean by epistemological uncertainty is that things are not fixed in storytelling, that also the belief narrative, it's quite a flexible and open concept. There is a discussion about the supernatural, what is possible, what is not. Often things are projected into the past. And, well, there is this question, it is how to relate to the stories, to take it seriously or not, and that's one of the basic questions in cognition. It's about the fact decision making between fact and fictionality. What is true and what is not, and of course there are a lot of humorous modalities, and not all belief narratives are taken seriously even when they're transmitted, but in other situations they might start to work to influence the behavior, to influence practices of people. And now the concept of liminality, of course, we know it has been taken over from the ritual studies and it's been applied in so many ways. We can also talk about the liminality between the story world and social reality, how experience is turned into a story, and how the things that we know from the shared stories can be perceived, or they can become a psychological reality for some people who carry the tradition. It's a kind of liminal world, or we can talk about the temporal liminality between the past, well, in the case of Mayong, the time of great magicians, and today when the magic is reduced, but the contemporary magician, they are like mediums or mediators. They can retrieve this knowledge from the past, and the status is also kind of liminal. Well, they know something that is secret, but they bring it to work in the social world. So these areas where things meet and then mix and interact, I think these are very, very interesting. A lot of work can be done there with these concepts.
Definitely. I remember this that you mentioned about even themselves were afraid that if something could be effective, maybe not.
Yeah.
I think that there lies some usefulness to try to address vernacular religion, like what people think in everyday life, to understand. But do you have any comments on that? But this maybe not. How we can understand it and what is the usefulness for the study of religion in general?
So that's also a question about epistemology. What we can do, and as scholars, of course, these are big questions that we ask: how to see the boundaries between world of fiction and world of facts and reality. But also people who carry these beliefs and ideas. They have similar kind of reflections. We can talk about vernacular theorizing. and things are very much left open. So you can make different decisions and see the world differently. So I think it is also useful sometimes to see how people actually talk and discuss. They very often they are aware of different frames of interpretation, and seeing how flexible it is in vernacular discussions. It's also maybe inspiring for scholarship.
Excellent. So it's has been very, very interesting to have this conversation with you, Professor Volk. I wonder if you have any concluding remarks or ideas for us for closing the podcast.
Well, you represent anthropology of religion, and I try to explain the perspective of folkloristics of religion. I think what makes our approaches interesting is that there is never a final conclusion, because also the sources that we are making, they are not ready. They are always in the making. We keep working with people, and these vernacular ideas and the practices, they always go ahead, they go beyond, and we need to catch them, to understand, to make sense, and that's also, it means being on the way all the time, being on the move, and thinking about what kind of concepts we need, and if they're becoming very technical, too narrow, they won't be so helpful. So we work always in a dialogue with other people who don't carry this academic burden of academic terminology and very scientific, rigorous methodology. And I think it's always wonderful to learn from them.
Excellent. I think that's a good idea for wrap up the podcast. We thank you again, Professor Volk, for being with us here at the Studies Break, and we hope to have you again soon.
Thank you for giving me this chance, and I hope to meet you soon at next conferences.
Perfect.
I'm so appreciative for all of Sidney Castillo's hard work at the EASR. We're really thankful for his ability to get a diverse group of folks to speak to that have never had the chance to appear on the Religious Studies Project podcast, or for a lot of folks in the U.S. maybe to have really ever heard of their work. And we're so pleased to be able to broaden and diversify the conversation with scholars that may be unfamiliar to American audiences in particular. I was really struck by the way that the emphasis on stories in this week's episode reminded me of some of the work that I read as a graduate student about placemaking and naming by an anthropologist named Keith Basso, who did work on the Subicu Apache Indians in Arizona. And they have just this wonderful relationship between place names and stories. And so every place for them has a story, and part of understanding what that place is telling the story about it. And it really changes the way that we think about the world when we start understanding that place names have more power that we can lend to them. Bree, you and I were talking a little bit before we recorded today, and you were saying that there's some similar ideas about place and naming down in Australia. Can you say something about that?
Yes, well, when I was listening to that podcast, it really struck me when Yulo was talking about the idea right at the end of the podcast that, we have to be open-minded as scholars, and we have to be, ready to catch things and ready to explore new avenues of understanding. And recently, a new sort of avenue of understanding struck me in terms of places and names. In Australia, whenever we have an event or even just a gathering, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, the Indigenous Australians. It will always be, and it always has been, their land. And in the workplace I work on the Gadigal, the land of the Gadigal people of Eora. And one day I was speaking to somebody who was much more learned in this than I was, and I was saying that I was acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And this individual came up to me and said, "You really should just say the Gadigal people of Eora." And I didn't understand. And they said, "Well, when white men landed in this space, in this place, he asked the Indigenous people, what is it called? What is this?" And they said, Eora, which means here. And so they just said, this is here. This is where we are. And they got translated into Eora Nation, the here nation, as opposed to just Eora. And so for me, that was a real moment of storytelling and narrative and place and religion and culture that is very important to me, and something that I think I had to, just work into my everyday, place of work, because it's about respect. It's about giving space to other people's cultures and ownership of those places. But shall we talk about what's coming up next week? Next week, Dave, I believe it's one of yours.
It is. Next week, I have an interview that we're slotting in because there's a new book coming out, and the publisher, Bloomsbury, was nice enough to send me a copy, an advanced copy of the book to read. And so I had a chance to look through it, and it's close to the area that I work on with charismatic Christians in the United States. And the new book is by Catherine Stewart, who's a journalist, and it's about religious nationalism in the contemporary period in the U.S., and it's political and religious kind of combination. And it's one of a very large number of books that have come out recently since the election of Trump in 2016 to try to talk about the fusion politically of religion and the political lives of conservative folks in the U.S. And so that's what's coming next week, is a politically charged interview with Catherine Stewart about religious nationalism.
Looking forward to that.
Oh, well, thank you. I hope that everybody finds it enjoyable. It's certainly going to be very timely and appropriate. And for listeners that are interested in that topic, we have a lot of recommendations that we can put on the podcast about other books that have come out in the last 2 or 3 years. The list that I made was 20 books long, I think. It's really a thriving area of publishing right now.
And also with the Democratic primaries coming up as well, it's very, very timely with what's going on over there.
It is. We are right in the thick of it right at this moment. But until then, I think all that's left for Bree and I to say is thanks for listening.
The RSP is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The Religious Studies Project is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SC047750.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Marek Sullivan and Rebecca Barrett-Fox, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bock. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio editing by Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop, and video editing by Jonathan Tuckett.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our amazon.com, .co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs, and you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.